bit. So how many of you all have been to an anti-trafficking training or presentation before? This is not an anti-trafficking training or presentation. I'm not going to be talking very much about trafficking. I'm not an expert in trafficking. In fact, I invite you all to not be experts in trafficking while we have this conversation today. There's a concept in Zen Buddhism called Shoshin. Anybody familiar with what we call beginner's mind? It's about kind of being empty so that you can fill, right? And approaching things as a beginner. And I encourage us all to kind of approach this with a beginner's mind. It's going to be unlike other anti-trafficking presentations that or trainings that you've been a part of. Because I'm going to be talking about commercial sexual exploitation and my 30 years of experience working with those who have been exploited and those who have chosen to exploit. And presently, I am working on a project called Modeling Equality, which is only 5 years old. But I've been working on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation for over 30 years. I got started not even knowing that I was going to be doing this work. I was primarily interested in stopping domestic violence. And I was interested in stopping domestic violence because I grew up in a domestic violence household. And I recognized pretty early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mom and my siblings and myself, that it was really his problem. Does that make sense? Right? It was his inability to deal with frustration, anxiety, disappointment, criticism, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out sideways on the people around him, on the people who loved him and on the people who he loved. As I got older, I found this wasn't just going on in my house, but in fact it was happening in lots of houses. And when it was happening, again, it was usually men that were doing this type of abuse. Most men don't do these types of things, but when these things that are done, they're mostly done by men. As I got older still, things happened like my sister came to me and told me that she'd been sexually assaulted. Other female and male friends of mine started talking to me about the abuse they experienced as kids. Again, disproportionately at the hands of men. Most men don't do these types of things, but when they're done by men, predominantly. So in the late 80s, I started doing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault prevention work. And I was involved with a group in Portland, Oregon, that trained men to go into middle schools and high schools to engage men and boys and talk about healthy relationships and preventing dating violence and sexual assault. And if I could go back in time to my younger self and say, hey, Peter, what about prostitution? I'd look at myself from the future and say, what the hell are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? That probably should be legalized and regulated, and what's the harm in it, really? I couldn't see it. But there was a remarkable group of women in Portland at that time that formed an organization called the Council for Prostitution Alternatives. And these were women that had been in the life and had gotten out of the life and had formed this organization. There were a few around the country, and we're fortunate enough to have one of the foremothers of that movement and that analysis in the room with us today. So you've got a wealth of resources here in Barb. When I got to meet these women and when I got to hear their stories, it turned my head around 180 degrees on prostitution. You know, I thought it had been a victimless crime, something people freely choose to do. But when I met these women, and I don't need to tell you all, but although they were adults, I found out they had entered the life as teenagers for the most part. They had experienced abuse, neglect in the home. Home wasn't safe. They ran from home. They were taken from home and placed elsewhere. They spent a great deal of time away from home, and they were vulnerable to exploitation by pimps who used physical, emotional, and sexual abuse to gain power and maintain control over them in systems that I was starting to recognize were remarkably consistent with other forms of intimate partner violence. If they managed to get out, few did without PTSD. Rates higher than military veterans. If they managed to. If they survived the abuse that they experienced at the hands of their buyers and at the hands of their pimps. So we quickly kind of thought with our beginners' minds the work that we were doing around gender-based violence, around domestic violence and sexual assault, and started integrating the issue of commercial sexual exploitation into the analysis. And the reason I say I'm not an anti-trafficking expert is because it would be another 10 years or so until we really started thinking about this in terms of trafficking. And the way that trafficking was defined, if it was an adult who was exploited, there was a need to have force, fraud, and coercion in order for it to meet the conditions to be trafficking. While I'm very grateful for the services that have come because of the TVPA, I think by defining trafficking in that way, it leaves a whole lot of exploitation out. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today, again, is commercial sexual exploitation rather than trafficking. They don't really exist apart from one another. You can't really talk about one without the other. But I think coming through the lens of commercial sexual exploitation will help us not leave anybody out of the conversation. Okay? And if you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to raise your hand or just shout out. Okay, so the way I view sex spying is, so my slide is on here, but not on there. I click the arrow. Click it again. There you go. Thank you, Stacy. So when we're talking about sex buying, one of the things that the TVPA did when we defined trafficking of adults as only that third-party exploitation by pimps and traffickers, it located the exploitation at the hands of pimps and traffickers. Right? And if people talked about the buying at all, it was that, well, buying creates the demand, and the demand creates the pimps and the profit motive in the exploitation. So in order to get the bad guys, who are the pimps and traffickers, we need to go after demand. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm here to say that demand in and of itself is exploitation. That sex buying is a form of sexual misconduct at the very best, being generous there. It's an abuse of power, and it exists on a continuum of sexual violence. It's not consensual. The money paid to the prostituted person is paid to not hear the reality of their lived experience. Right? So if I get a room full of sex buyers that I'm working with, usually the first night, they want to talk about how the person who chose to do this and they didn't do anything wrong, and that actually this was mutual, consensual, that it wasn't a problem. And I always ask them a few questions. I say, well, suppose that you picked up somebody on the track or on the internet and asked them how old they were, and they were 15. What would they say? What do you think the buyers say?
18.
Yeah, 21. They say, okay. And suppose you ask her, do you have a pimp? And she has a pimp. What do you think she'll say? And suppose you ask her, do you enjoy what you do? And the last thing that she wants to do is be with you. What is she going to say?
Yep.
It's called a trick for a reason. It's called a trick because he's paying for the illusion that this is consensual. But in fact, it's abuse of power and exists on a continuum of sexual violence. A continuum being a spectrum, from the most overt forms of violence and abuse, sexualized murder. And do you think people in prostitution are subject to that most overt form of violence? More so than other women or other men? Right? On down the continuum, we can talk about sexual assaults. Do you think women in prostitution experience more sexual assaults than others? certainly. To forms of sexual harassment, do you think that they experience forms of sexual harassment more than others? Yeah, right. And so we can look at sex buying as an abuse of power that exists on a continuum of sexual violence. At best, it's a form of sexual misconduct. You know? We now are in the Me Too era. It's been, over 5 years now that we've been talking about equality in the workplace, hostile environments. If I've learned anything from Me Too, it's that sexual activity should not be a condition of employment. And if sexual activity should not be a condition of employment, then it should not be a condition of employment, right? If sexual harassment, quid pro quo sexual harassment, creates inequality in the workplace, prostitution creates inequality in the world. And we need to look at it that way. And the demand is not a problem just because it causes third-party exploitation and trafficking. It's a problem because it's a problem. And the primary problem in prostitution is not that it involves sex. The primary problem is the harm experienced by people who are exploited. And in my younger days, at this junction, I would start talking to you about the brutality of the life and all of the harm that's experienced. And while I still think it's important to recognize those things, even if the level of harm somebody experienced isn't as high as those most egregious offenses, if we look at the vast majority of people in prostitution, they experience all this stuff: depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, low esteem, self-esteem, shame, guilt, PTSD, and suicide attempts, both when they're in the life and when they get out of the life. And that's bad enough, regardless of the other harms that they've experienced on top of that, which are many. So primarily, people in prostitution are those that are harmed by sex buying. But there's also an evidence for a connection between sexual aggression of other forms and prostitution. Buying sex has been associated with men's perpetration of other forms of gender-based violence, like perpetration of physical and sexual violence against their intimate partners. Rape against both partners and non-partners. College men who have used women in prostitution reported committing more sexually coercive behaviors. And this is true globally and cross-culturally, that when we see men who buy sex, they tend to be the same men that are doing other forms of violence against women. And this kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people think of as the kind of conventional lack of wisdom of this kind of catharsis idea, right? That somehow if we don't have this legitimate target group of people in prostitution, that the good girls are going to get hurt, that other girls are going to get raped. But in fact, we know that that's not true. If somebody's willing to dehumanize and objectify and sexualize somebody in prostitution, it's likely that they have the same issues around power, control, and entitlement that are at the root of other forms of sexual violence as well as domestic and dating abuse. Right? So it's not like they're different populations. Okay. We know that women who are in prostitution and men and trans people who are in prostitution, most of them want to get out. When you ask them, depending on the survey you're looking at, 80, 90% of people in prostitution say they want to get out. What people don't often think about is that for buyers, 64% of them agreed or strongly agree with the statement, I would like to stop buying sex. Is that surprising to you? Yeah. Because the question then is pretty clear. It's like, well, why don't they stop buying sex? So to take a look at that, I want to unpack that with you a little bit and talk to you about my thoughts about why men buy sex. Because I think the tendency is to initially think, well, if they want to stop and they can't stop, that it maybe is some sort of addiction or compulsive behavior. And while that's true for some, maybe 1 in 6 men who buy sex have an addiction or a compulsion, they're still choosing to target a particular population, right? And it's still really fundamentally about power and control. So I'm going to give you a few quotes from men that I've worked with over the years who bought sex when I asked them why they did. Here's one guy who's very honest. He said, I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. Didn't want to risk it, right? Didn't want to risk intimacy or rejection. Oh, let's call him a catword. Here's another guy. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. Said the same thing in a different way. I love sex, but I hate women. And this one was a little much for even me, so I stopped him and I said, hold on, what do you mean you love sex, but you hate women? And he said, well, I love sex, but I hate women because I was married to one of them, meaning women, for 15 years, and she left me and took half of everything I had, and I'm never going to trust another one of them again. So I'm just going to pay for sex. And then it dawned on me. I was like, oh, you're hurt. You feel betrayed. And rather than putting on your big boy pants and moving through your grief, you're going to blame half of humanity and target them because of your own inability to deal with heartbreak. 5 weeks into the class, he came up to me and he said, Peter, this class is really helping. I think I'll start dating again. And I thought to myself, oh no, what have I done? The unintended consequences of this program are putting my sisters at risk. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. Same idea. Okay, so really if we're thinking about where those ideas come from, they have to do with what we learn about what it means to be a man in the world. And we get these messages early and often. If I'm little 6-year-old Peter and my father's looming over me saying, why don't you just act like a man? Learning a couple things there. First, I'm learning I'm doing something wrong. And I got to change it because I don't want to be yelled at anymore. And secondly, I'm learning a whole string of characteristics and behaviors that I'm supposed to embody if I'm going to be a real man in the world. And so what do you think some of those are? If you think about emotionally, what is a, quote, real man expected to be emotionally? Don't cry, right? That's one of the rules, certainly. It's really don't have any emotions. There are a few okay manly emotions to have, like anger's okay, pride's okay. Horny, not really an emotion, but it's one that we're taught to be able to express as if it is. In a lot of ways, a lot of things get funneled into horny for men. But any of those soft, considered more feminine emotions like sadness and loneliness and anxiety and vulnerability and lots of things like that are considered kind of not manly emotions to have. Do you think men really don't have them, or are we taught not to show them? How healthy is that for us? Yeah. How healthy is it for the people around us? What this does is it sets this manhood standard that we get challenged to live up to. What's that manhood standard around sex? Like if you think back to high school, middle school, what made a boy popular amongst his peers in terms of his sexual activity? How many girlfriends he had, right? Lots of sex partners. And did he consider his peers? Whose judgment was it that he was concerned about?
His friends.
Yeah, who were other guys, right, primarily. So I'm trying to score with girls, or lying about scoring with girls, in order to enhance my standing in the all-male peer group. That's a recipe for disaster. In terms of my ability to be intimate with this other person. And if we take a look at the training that we get as men about sex and sexuality, do you think that we're taught as men that we need to know a lot about sex before we're sexual? We need to be the ones that take the initiative? And so where are we going to get our information from? Where did we get our information about sex when we were growing up? Peers. And where else? Pornography, yeah, Playboy. For me, old timers here like me, that might have meant Playboy or Penthouse or Hustler. Now it's more this and more humiliating and degrading sorts of stuff. How good is the information that we got about sex from our male peers at 12 and 13 years old and pornography? Not very good, right? And how did that get in the way of our being able to really connect in a relaxed and enjoyable way when we were in our early sexual experiences? How did that get in the way of us actually being able to be sure that everything was mutual and consensual and recognize when somebody wasn't interested in doing something? How many of us, like myself, learned that no didn't mean no, it meant try again 5 minutes later? And that eventually, you'll wear her down. That's not what mutuality and consent looks like. But I think it was, and it remains part of the way that we learn about sex. What does this have to do with sex buying? The same sort of objectification, the same sort of dehumanization that we learn, and the same sort of women as transactional currency in the male-peer relationship, assuaging our anxiety about our gendered identity as men, is this existing for us then and exists for many sex buyers now. They're not thrilled about that whole thing. Thoreau has a quote that I love: "Most men lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them." And I often think of my dad and my grandfather. And we were a big Italian family in New York, so they didn't go so quietly. They went rather loudly. But they were never really able to sing their song. They were so concerned about having power over other people and being the man there that it got in the way of their relationships. And I love my dad. I have really great memories of him. At his best, he was awesome and able to connect and love me deeply and was very proud of me, and I miss him greatly. He died several years ago. But he never really got to fully step into his authentic humanity as a human being in the world. My grandfather definitely didn't. Because my father was an improved version of my grandfather. He was even more abusive than my dad was. And there weren't as many of those glimmers of his potential and possibility. I still wonder about what it would have been like for them if they didn't have the ideas that they did about masculinity. So some of the best work that's been done about men and love and lust and sex has been done by a woman whose name is Bell Hooks, and she died last year. And she said most men think that sex will provide them with a sense of being alive, connected, it will offer closeness, intimacy, pleasure, and more often than not, sex simply does not deliver the goods. This fact does not lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing. This is what we learn from the culture. The culture holds out to men that we can get our relational needs met through non-relational sex. But you can't get there from here. You can't meet relational needs through non-relational sex, but then that's why it doesn't deliver the goods, and it doesn't lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing. So when men are seeking intimacy, when men are seeking connection, when men are seeking really relationship, the culture says that you can get those needs met through non-relational sex. And you risk nothing in terms of vulnerability if you try and target somebody who is not going to be able to say no. Whether it's in a brief encounter, whether it's a girlfriend experience, which, by the way, is not a real girlfriend experience. I've had girlfriends. They don't, and they've all had minds of their own, and they've all given me a hard time when I've been a jerk. Again, paying for the illusion of the girlfriend that doesn't question somebody's dominance in the context of their relationship. Okay, so as men, we get these messages, certainly growing up, about what it means to be a man. And we also get a lot of messages about women and girls. And unlike the act like a man sort of standard, the box, I think that for girls, the way that boys are taught to think about them is to think about them as two categories, good girls and bad girls. Now, think about the good girl category. What are some things that you would associate with this idea of being a good girl? What is a good girl?
Quiet.
She's quiet, yep. How about, what does she wear?
Modest.
Modest. Someone say cardigans?
Yes.
All right. And does she drink alcohol, take drugs? Does she smoke? How about sexually? Missionary, and only in the context of a long-term relationship, of marriage, right? So if you think about this idea of bad girl, because again, this is about categories. This is not about real people. Real women aren't good girls and bad girls. These are categories that we impose on people and treat them accordingly, depending on what category we put them in. But if you think about bad girls, what are some of the words, phrases that we associate with bad girls?
Easy.
Easy. And what are the names that we call them?
Slut.
Whore, slut. What do those names have to do with?
Sex.
And what else? Prostitution, right? It's no accident that those names have to do with prostitution. Because prostitution is like the archetype for the bad girl. And it's also used, the bad girl concept, to blame the victim for what's happened to her. Right? If you think about a sexual assault that happens, what are the victim-blaming type of questions that people ask? What were you wearing? Right? Were you drinking? Drying drugs? What's your sexual history? Right. The question is really, are you a whore? Because you probably let him on. And if you say you were raped, you're probably lying about it because you're trying to drag down a good man's name. One of the early survivors in Minneapolis, a woman named Evelina Giobbi, had a quote that I just love. She said, "Prostitution isn't like anything else. Rather, everything else is like prostitution because it's the model for women's condition." Domestic violence cases. How often is a batterer yelling at the person he's abusing, and what's he accusing her of? Infidelity. Saying those words, "You're a slut, you're a whore. You deserve what you get." We had a rape case when I was in Seattle. There was a rape where someone had sexually assaulted someone and thrown money on them as they walked away. There was the consent for you, right there. Sexual harassment in the workplace. Well, what was she expecting? Of course I grabbed her, wearing an outfit like that. She's a bad girl, she deserves what she gets. So I think that it's important to recognize how these things impact the way that we think, not just about prostitution, but other forms of gender-based violence as well. They're all connected. And the men know this. This is one of our participants in our sex buyers class. If you scratch the surface, they're all whores underneath. Who did he mean all? Right. All sex is transactional, all women are whores. We would hear this all the time. You pay somehow. I was on a Zoom call with a small Midwestern city doing a presentation because they were considering doing this 10-week sex buyers class that I developed in Seattle. And the judges were on the call. And I got to, not that slide. Which one is it? This slide. We all pay somehow. And I looked at his little picture on the computer screen, and he was snickering to himself, as if to say, "Oh yeah, I feel you, buddy, we do. We all pay somehow." You know, this idea that all sex is transactional. And some of them in the class, they eventually will kind of say, that's not true, that there is mutual sex out there that is not transactional. But we used to get guys every now and then. We got one in particular one time who, even at the end of it, the other guys in the class were like, come on, man. You got to stop it with the all sex is transactional stuff. It's not. It can be different. It can be freely chosen between people. So what I'm trying to get at here with this, the whole part of this presentation, the entire presentation today, is that this is not just about a few bad apples, that there are a few bad apples, and they've been produced in a culture that's made them rotten. And that we need to address the culture that's made them rotten, as well as addressing those few bad apples. So when we're thinking about addressing trafficking and prostitution, we need to think about addressing the few bad apples, certainly, but more importantly, addressing the culture. Right? If those apples are in a warm, wet environment, they're going to go off way sooner. Put them in your basement, nice and cold. I wish it was so easy with sex buyers, right? It's normative. Most men don't buy sex, but it's normative. How could that be? Because I didn't say it's normal, it's normative. It sets a norm. And I'll explain a little bit about that later on, but I think this guy started to get at it. He said, I always thought that buying sex was just normal for men. It was just something we did sometimes. I didn't really think about it. I didn't care about the women. When I got the sex buyers in my class, I would say to them, early in the class, what percentage of men do you think buy sex? And what do you think the sex buyers would say? They would say, or 90%. They'd be like, 95%. Every guy does it. We just don't talk about it. Or I talk about it with all my friends, and we all do. It's like 10%. But for him, part of his rationalization for the reason he does it is that all men do it. When in fact, it's really not true. It's rooted in these concepts of hegemonic, or what is commonly called toxic masculinity. And toxic masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, is not assumed to be normal in a statistical sense. Only a minority of men might enact it, right? That 10% in this case. But it is normative in that it embodies a currently most honored, or I might say feared way of being a man, and it requires other men to position themselves in relation to it, and ideologically legitimates the subordination of women to men. That's a mouthful, an eyeful up there. So I'll give you a quick example of what that looks like in practice. I'm in my sex buyers group. There's 12 men sitting there. I'm in week number 4 talking to them about sexual assault, and I'm talking to them about the history of marital rape and legislation. And I say to them, do you know, just 40 years ago in this country, more than half of the states had an exemption for marital rape, where a man could not be charged with rape if the person he was raping was his wife. And one of the guys speaks up and says, yeah, I call them the good old days. What do you think the other guys in the room do? Well, a couple of them chuckle, right? They were the ones taking up a lot of space and tough guys. But a couple of them chuckle. A couple of them are like looking at their feet, not making eye contact with anybody. A couple of them are looking like desperately at me. In my younger days, I would have jumped in there and told them what for. But I thought, I'm just going to wait for a minute until one of them says something. What's it going to take? And I waited. I waited probably 30 seconds until I had to jump in and say, really, no one is going to say anything. All of you think it's okay to rape your wife. And then one of the bravest amongst them finally found the courage deep within them to say, no, I don't think it's okay to rape your wife. I was like, oh, fantastic. Here's a cookie. After class, 2 more guys came up to me and said, hey, Peter, man, I just want you to know, I didn't agree with that guy. The gauntlet had been thrown. Most of the guys in that room did not agree with that bad apple, right? But what he was doing was showing a very feared way of being a man, and it required them to position themselves in relation to it. And we saw that happening, right? The guy who's chuckling, I'm aligned with you. The guy who's looking at your feet, I'm not going to betray the male bond. The guy who's looking at me, I don't know what to do. Right? They're positioning themselves in relation to the suppressive gauntlet that's been thrown. And none of them had the courage to step up and say something. And why not?
This is part of the culture.
Yeah, because they don't want to be a pussy. Because if you're a pussy and a punk and a fag, you're going to be targeted by other men, perhaps violently. And so you're not going to say anything. And in that process, we're selling out all of our sisters and our queer brothers and the best parts of ourselves that are relational, can be compassionate, empathetic, loving, and tender. If we're going to step into the kind of humanity that this world is asking for right now, we need to have the courage to be able to engage our brothers and say no. Nuh-uh. Backwards. Okay, male bonding. Okay, when I say male bonding, I'm not talking about friendships with men. I love my friends. I think they're awesome. I reach out to them when I'm having a hard time. Great to talk to. I support them when they're having a hard time. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about going out, fishing and talking about your lives, and that's great. We need to do more of that and actually connecting with one another in real ways. What I'm talking about is the type of male bonding where it's a social bond that impacts the sexual relationships, right? And these all-male groups shape the sexual relations that we engage in as men. They give meaning to our sexual involvements and the development of narratives about them. And so what this does is it organizes our socio-sexual relations in at least 4 ways that I'm going to talk about. Right? First, male-male friendships take priority over male-female relationships. What is it in the vernacular? Bros before hoes. Again, not an accident that the words have to do with prostitution. Number 2, platonic friendships with women are dangerously feminizing. It's like a little bit of the man code here. Number 3, heterosexual sex itself can be the medium through which male bonding is enacted. I'm not just talking about gang rape here, but I think we can look at prostitution itself as a system being a medium through which male bonding is enacted, even if they're not doing it as a group. Because it's a shared population that we're exploiting as a sex class of men. And men's sexual storytelling is shaped by homosocial masculine cultures. Anybody play sports? I was football, basketball, lacrosse player. How good solid was the information that we got in the locker room in high school and middle school around sex? Right? That's the type of culture. I love playing sports. I would still be playing basketball if my knees weren't shot. But and I love the guys I played with. I love my team members. But one thing that we didn't have was the skills to be able to talk openly and honestly about sex with one another. And that was because of the culture that we grew up in. It really did us a disservice. So anyway, you get the picture. So the way historically that we've looked at the crime of prostitution has been to look at whose fault was it, historically. Who was responsible for this? The person who was exploited. Right? In domestic violence, we used to always ask the question, what did you do to set him off that way? Like somehow blaming the victim. And in prostitution, this was, in law, pretty much, she was looked at as the fallen woman who was leading a good man astray. And, honestly, in the 80s and 90s, when I first started doing this work, it was not uncommon when I talked with a woman who'd been in prostitution to hear the stories of, when I got arrested, they caught me with the John. They took my money. They said, how much did you give her? They gave it back to the John, and they said, you go home, and then they'd take me away. Right? It was her fault. She was the criminal. It was considered a moral crime, a moral issue. And that was reflected in the criminal laws about who it was, whose fault it was, and who was going to be held to account. How well did that work, policing the victims, in terms of stopping prostitution? Right. How well did it work to help women who were in the life get out? Not well, right? That's why things have changed. And that's why we're still in the process of changing things, right? To make it work better and to start to hold those account who really have the power to change things and who are really doing the harm. And so what Sweden did is found in the 70s that it wasn't working to criminalize people in prostitution. And so what they decided to do first was to fully decriminalize for everybody. The buyer, the brothel keepers, and the person in prostitution. What happened immediately and escalated after the fall of the Soviet Union was demand went up and trafficking went through the roof. Because they had set a norm that said buying sex is okay. And so having a commitment to equality, Sweden looked at the law and said, this isn't right. We got it wrong. We need to change this. And so what they said is, let's criminalize the buyers and the traffickers, but let's offer services for adults and youth who have been exploited. And in addition, let's have a robust community education program to change the norms that are at the root of this practice. The norms that drive blaming the victims and the norms that drive men's entitlement. This is what's known in a lot of places as the Swedish model or the Nordic model. And it's not just a legal regime, right? The reason I call my project Modeling Equality is because 10 minutes, okay. The reason I call the project Modeling Equality is because I think it's possible to do a lot of this without legislation. I think it's possible to, if we think about this issue in a different way, to enact policies and practices that are consistent with the values of the equality model. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Oh, my formatting got all messed up. And I always think it's weird to have a quote of myself. But I was invited to the Carter Center in Atlanta several years ago in 2017 because we were developing this coalition in Seattle, Washington, King County, Washington, where we decided we weren't going to push for the Nordic model legislatively, but we were going to try to do it. We were just going to try to do it by robust community education, engaging partners in the prosecutor's office and elsewhere. And so the woman that was representing Ireland got up and said, we finally got the Nordic model legislation in Ireland, haven't been able to really get it happening on the ground because, there's too many barriers. People don't support it. The guy from France stood up and he said, I wish I could do a French accent and an Irish accent. That would make this way more interesting, but I can't do either of those things, so just bear with me. He said the same thing. We had just passed the Nordic model in France, but we're having a lot of problem getting buy-in. And it was my turn to talk. I said, we don't have the Nordic model legislatively, but we're figuring out how to operationalize it and how to implement it on the ground. And so this is, I think, the model. We have things that we do with exploited persons, things that we do with exploiters, including sex buyers, and then community education. With exploited persons, we want to do prevention work. We want to have comprehensive survivor-led exit program for youth and adults, right? For adults too, because they so often get left out. Immediately and safe and easy access to all necessary resources and support. Again, this is aspirational, right? We got to work towards this. And establishing real alternatives. Having real choices. Because prostitution is usually not about a lot of choices. It's about your choices being systematically narrowed until you feel like there's no other option. It's a choice of desperation. So having real alternatives is very important. For exploiters, we need to do prevention work. We need to do disruption, intervention, accountability, and transformation. For pimps as well as buyers. You all can't do all that. You all can do very little of this. We need others in the community to step up. I think so often the burden gets placed on law enforcement. And you know more than anybody that we're not going to wrest our way out of this. Diversion in and of itself is not going to stop this. But diversion in connection with a robust prevention program and all of these other elements is where we're going to really be able to move the needle. And you need partners in the community to do that. So this is not just something for law enforcement. This is something we all need to get engaged in, and especially as men. Right? In terms of community education, again, doing prevention and focusing on changing the norms that blame the exploited and those that support men's entitlement. And we need to engage across sectors to promote personal, community, systemic transformation. I could do a whole another couple of hours on that, like this a social ecological model and how we do engage with others to transform culture. It would be not as exciting as this presentation. So if we're thinking about what we're doing with buyers, we can think about direct interventions with buyers and potential buyers along a spectrum of prevention and intervention, not just after the fact, right? And so just to outline kind of in broad strokes what that looks like, the CDC breaks down gender-based violence into three forms of prevention: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Intervention, right? Primary prevention, preventing violence from happening way, way upstream. Secondary prevention, preventing it when it's at risk for happening. Tertiary prevention, preventing something from happening again once it's already happened. And where do you think we get the most bang for our buck in terms of investments into prevention work? Yeah, right. So keep that in mind. That I like to think of this as an inverted triangle, right? That most of our attention should be focused far upstream. You know, and I was talking last night about a group in San Diego that's doing social emotional learning with fourth grade boys, gender-specific fourth grade boys talking about social emotional development and learning. To me, and they designed this program, a friend of mine, Bianca, designed this program to stop them from being sex buyers later on. What else is it going to stop? It might, yeah, abuse, bullying, suicide, homicide, alcoholism. Our boys are at risk of hurting themselves and others because of the culture that we raise them in. So, lots of things that we can do. It's an inverted pyramid, and people always ask me, well, the thing that you're known for is actually this point that, that you're saying we should do very little of. I still think it's really important to do that work, because some of the way that we're able to engage folks to talk about the harm of commercial sexual exploitation is through those quotes that I showed you earlier. And I think if we're going to really move the needle, we need to be able to know those buyers, and we need to be able to empower those buyers to step forward and talk about what they did, why they did it, and how they changed. But there's all this other stuff that we could do upstream. And if you'll notice, the arrest, prosecution, conviction, and post-conviction intervention program, or diversion, depending on how you structure things, this is all important, super important, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And that's why we need to develop community responses that are coordinated to meet those needs that I outlined in the equality model slide. Because it's just not a few bad apples. So I think that in my work, people often say, how do you do this type of work for so many years? You know, working with survivors, working with men who are abusive. And for me, it's a privilege to do this work. It's been an invitation into my own process around accountability. And although it may be dark, that I love this quote from Bertolt Brecht, who said, "In the dark times will there also be singing?" Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. Right? That we're in pretty dark times, but we're together and we're relational. We don't need to live lives based on fear, but we can live lives based on love. I know it sounds super corny, but I believe it's true. And so I would invite you all to take a new look with your beginner's minds at the issue of trafficking through a lens of commercial sexual exploitation. Find your own superpowers and figure out what you can bring to the equation to help us move the needle and stop human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And with that, I will turn it over to Barb, who's going to talk with you. Or are we going to do questions after, right? Yeah, after. So if you have questions, we'll do them after Barb talks to you a bit more about what's going on locally and her own experience with this issue. Thanks.